Your excuse if you like. Oh, our substitutes are welcome to stay and listen to the presentation.
But it's not.
Otherwise, you're free to go.
Thank you. Okay.
Probably half hour, 45 minutes. Yeah, I don't know.
There you go.
I mean, yeah, I think we'll be done by then.
Yes, exactly.
Our pleasure. Thank you for volunteering to substitute. Yeah, it is. It can be.
The interesting, right, the group of people who voted on both sides of that issue, it's just a weird combination. You know, you'll never see those exact alignments on any of them. Are we breaking for 5 minutes?
As soon as they get set up here. Yeah. So when everybody's back in, we'll get started. I'm sorry to keep you.
Oh yeah, no worries. We'll give it a few minutes. Thanks.
So, waiting for verbal. Okay. Thank you very much.
Something what you're looking for?
Yes, and I think we can give that to Jean and written in the
Okay.
office there. All right. 1 second while Representative Davis comes back from delivering that paper, and we'll get started. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the committee for inviting us here to give an update on soil PFAS in New Hampshire and an update on biosolids. My name is Jeff Martz. I'm the administrator of the Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau at DES. I'm also a hydrogeologist, and our bureau is tasked with developing soil remediation standards for PFAS. And I'm going to give the update on soil, and then Anthony Druin here will talk more about biosolids. So I want to cover 4 topics in a relatively short period of time, give you a high-level overview. The first is the USGS soil study task number 1, which was to evaluate soil PFAS in shallow soil across the state. Then I'm going to give an example of PFAS in soil at a contaminated site. Next, I'm going to talk about the USGS Task 2 laboratory leaching experiments. I'm only going to briefly touch on that. And then I'm going to get into the New Hampshire DES PFAS soil remediation standard development, give you a brief update on where we are. So back in 2019, when new lower stringent standards were adopted for PFAS in groundwater, it became apparent that we were going to have to adopt eventually standards that were protective of groundwater. But there was a lot of emerging science on the complexity of how PFAS behave in the environment. And we thought it was important to identify, 1, what type of PFAS are present in New Hampshire soils, and 2, identify some of the factors specific to New Hampshire soils that affect leachability of these compounds. So DES partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey to do a 3-part study that included 1, the characterization of shallow soil PFAS, which I'll talk about on some more slides. Task 2 was to assess the partitioning or the passage of PFAS from soil to liquid in the environment, and what are the important factors that influence that in our state soils. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. It's a very complex topic, but I'm going to talk about how that's going to inform our soil remediation standard development. Finally, the Task 3 evaluated PFAS transport at 2 sites One that was an AFFF release site, and the other was a Biosolids site. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the results of that study. So here's a slide that was put together by Andrea Tokranov, the lead investigator from the USGS, as well as her team, including Leah Santangelo and Sydney Welch, as well as some DES staff, Kata Maslosher, myself, and Anthony Druin. And I'm going to show several slides that were put together by USGS, and they have the USGS logo in the bottom. So the study design for the soil sampling across the state, the purpose of that was to characterize PFAS in shallow soil in areas throughout New Hampshire that are not known to be impacted by a contaminated or a local PFAS source. So to do this, the USGS gridded the state into 100 equal area cells and then classified lands as either forested, shrubland, or herbaceous to kind of filter out urban lands. And then they placed a 500-meter buffer around parcels where we had potential PFAS contamination or releases. And next, they used GIS to randomly generate sites for sampling. And each one of those 100 sites was sampled, the soil was sampled from 0 to 6 inches, and then at 50 of those sites, they collected a sample from 6 to 12 inches, and at a smaller subset, they collected some deeper soil samples to characterize PFAS across the state. So I'm going to jump right into some of the results from this study. And on the left-hand side, showing the concentration that was detected in the shallow soil samples for PFOA, one of the compounds that we regulate in groundwater. And the units presented are in nanograms per gram, which is equivalent to a part per billion in soil. And it's important to differentiate that from parts per trillion that we regulate in groundwater, so different orders in magnitude. But the scale goes from below detection at 0.5 to greater than 3 parts per billion for PFOA. And one of the takeaways when you look at this graph is that the colors get warmer, meaning there's generally an increase in concentration as you move from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state. Next, moving to the middle plot is the concentration of PFOS. And what we see is a more random distribution of some of the higher concentrations compared to the lower concentrations. And we're currently investigating why that might be, but it could be a function of how PFOS behaves. It tends to be a little stickier to soil compared to PFOA. And finally, the plot on the right is a measure called the TOP assay, which is used to measure the presence of precursors. So I think you probably heard that there are thousands of PFAS chemicals, but we only regulate 4. So this TOP assay was to get at whether there are precursors in the soil. And the good news, the takeaway is that there seem to be very little precursors present in New Hampshire soils. This is a very complex plot showing the concentrations detected for each of the PFAS compounds. So the PFAS compounds are listed across the bottom. It's a bar and whisker plot with concentration of PFAS in soil increasing towards the top of the plot. And what I'd like you to take away is that this blinking blue line is at the concentration of 1 part per billion. And that 1 part per billion is the common laboratory detection limit for most commercial laboratories. So one of the key takeaways from the study is that most of the soil samples for most of the compounds were below that detection limit by most common laboratories. So they wouldn't have been detected if we sent them to any laboratory. So the USGS worked with the laboratory that DES was using to develop a lower detection limit in order to characterize these soils. I also want to call your attention to the black bold line in the center of the boxes. That value represents the median or an average of the samples for each compound. And if you look at PFOA, which is towards the left-hand side of the plot, you can see that the median for PFOA is just below that 1 part per billion minimum detection level for common laboratories. And similarly, PFOS, which is on the right-hand side, that median value is very close to that 1 part per billion level. So next I'm going to talk briefly about an example of a contaminated site, St. Cobain in southern New Hampshire, where they had air emissions. The image on the right is a depiction and a colored representation of the modeled air deposition of the compound PFOA, with the warmer colors, the yellows, representing a higher concentration of PFOA that was deposited on the ground, and the cooler colors representing lower concentrations, but not insignificant with respect to groundwater. And what we see when we zoom in on the site, the image on the left is an excerpt from one of the site investigation reports showing PFOA in soil. And what you can see from the orange colored samples is that some of the samples on this figure exceeded 200 parts per billion, which is our direct contact value for soil. So we had very high concentrations. So most of the data from the USGS sampling effort was below a part per billion, and adjacent to Saint-Gobain, we had in excess of 200 parts per billion, just to give you a sense of the range. And if you look at AFFF release sites, we also see hundreds of parts per billion where AFFF was applied to the ground. Tying this to the groundwater, it's very complex and kind of like an onion, that there are many layers that influence ultimately the concentrations that we see in groundwater. So the amount of air deposition that occurs, the superficial geology coupled with the bedrock geology, as well as time-related factors such as changes in the chemicals released over time, seasonal variations, all influence what we see when we sample groundwater. And the image on the lower right represents PFOA measured in water supply wells inside the Saint-Gobain consent decree area. And we see a very complex pattern where the green dots represent less than half of our ambient groundwater quality standard of 12, so that's 0 to 6 parts per trillion. And they can be immediately adjacent to water supply wells that exceed our standard of 12 parts per trillion. So we see this very complex pattern, and I attribute that to the many complexities of how these compounds move through the environment. Switching gears now, I'm going to talk a little bit about SRS, the soil remediation standard development. So we have a directive from the legislature to initiate rulemaking for the 4 compounds that we regulate in groundwater. That rulemaking must be initiated by November 1st. Now, we do have the direct contact risk-based values, which I said some of the soil at Saint-Gobain exceeds 200 for PFOA. So our S1 direct contact risk-based values to be protective of a child playing in the soil and maybe incidental ingestion, and it's 200 for PFOA and 100 for the other 3 compounds that we regulate. This is a chart. We'll provide some PDFs so you can look at this later, but this is a chart put together by the ITRC summarizing national values, and as you can, just a brief takeaway is that they're substantially lower than our direct contact values. There are 5 factors that we consider when we're developing a soil remediation standard. They include those direct contact risk-based soil concentrations that I mentioned, and then they involve leaching-based soil concentrations. So this is where that task 2 from the USGS study comes into play, where they looked at various factors that influence leachability, such as pH, total organic carbon content, and even things such as protein. So we factor all this in as we evaluate leachability of these compounds. Third, we have to take into account background concentrations. So that's where task 1 of the USGS study, where the 100 samples come into play to help inform our understanding of background and what concentrations are occurring in soils across the state. Fourth, we're going to take into account sealing concentrations, and these generally tend to apply to other compounds that have odor thresholds, so I don't expect that to play a big role, but it's something we're considering. And finally, practical quantification limits. So this speaks to the laboratory's ability to detect these compounds. And like I mentioned earlier on that bar and whisker plot, conventional laboratories at the time we did this study were detecting down to about 1 part per billion. But there are some new EPA methods coming along that are expected to have a lower practical quantification limit, so we'll be able to measure these compounds at lower concentrations. So lastly, I just want to close by tying this into groundwater. The map on the right shows wells that contain less than half of our standard of 12 parts per trillion for PFOA. So the green shows 0 to 6 parts per trillion in groundwater samples. So even though we are seeing a widespread occurrence of PFAS in soils across the state, that doesn't necessarily equate to widespread exceedance of our current standards for PFOA and our other compounds. So with that, I can either turn it over to Anthony or take questions.
I have a question. How does New Hampshire compare to other states with regard to the concentrations that you're measuring?
That's a great question. If we had more time, I could show a slide comparing us to Vermont. Vermont did a study back in like 2018, and our value, our for PFOA was probably a little higher on average than Vermont, but generally they track somewhat similarly.
Representative Murray?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. One of the things that I do want to ask is, we're well aware that New Hampshire has the 12 parts per trillion standard that was enacted into law, but as far as the current US EPA is looking at national drinking water standards that may expand into looking at 6 PFAS sort of chains, and I was curious to know, are you seeing any parity? I understand that chemicals react differently in soils than they do water, but are you seeing any effort or desire from your department to perhaps follow what's happening with the national drinking water standards, obviously, and then adjust soil and or water based on what comes out of that?
Great question. So by law, if those federal MCLs are adopted, so those are drinking water standards, they would be adopted most likely as drinking water standards in the state, and then by law, our ambient groundwater quality standard would become equivalent to those federal MCLs. So the new ambient groundwater quality standard would become 4 if they were adopted as proposed for PFOA and PFOS.
Any other questions? No, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And will we be able to get emailed a copy of the slides?
Yeah, we'll email PDFs of the
Thank you.
slides. I know there's a lot in there.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, so, good morning, everyone, and
Good
I
morning.
want to thank Madam Chair for inviting me today to speak to you guys. My name is Anthony Druin. I'm the supervisor of the Residuals Management Section at New Hampshire DES. We are the section within the Wastewater Engineering Bureau that does regulate biosolid land application, the hauling of sludge, the management of biosolids or sludge post wastewater treatment facility, and also the management of septage in the state. So today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about biosolid regulations, the Clean Water Act, why we're here, what is sludge management, and how did it become what it is today. Just a little bit of what our education outreach efforts have been since 2018, 2019, when PFAS really hit the news for wastewater. Going to talk about how is sludge septage and leachate managed in the state. Going to give you some numbers, some annual numbers to look at, to think about how much volume do we create. And then the investigation that we've been doing since 2017. Just as a note, I joined DES in August of 2018. I immediately took over the PFAS investigation and all the work related to PFAS and biosolids. And then that investigation ramped up to beyond biosolids, and we looked into collection systems, which you'll see that data today. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the future of sludge management in New Hampshire, the technologies that we are looking at for destruction of sludge, and maybe some assistance we could have in looking further into those technologies. So first, I always do a quick shameless plug of who we are. Right now, we are down 1 person. It's pretty common at DES at this time, unfortunately. But as you can see, I'm the supervisor. I have oversight of the Sludge Quality Certification Program, which I'll go over. That is the permit to distribute biosolids in the state of New Hampshire. We do have a permitting enforcement engineer. She just left our section recently to go to a different section at DES. So we are looking for a new engineer for that position. Unfortunately, we don't have any applicants yet, but that'll hopefully change soon. Wade Pelham is our sludge and septage coordinator. He does all our education outreach. He runs our water and wastewater managers school, where we take operators and get them to be trained to be managers, the future superintendents of New Hampshire. And then Jim Talvey is our inspector. He inspects all our hauling, land application, and facilities like our lagoons that we have oversight of with the permit system. So just real quick, prior to the Clean Water Act, our rivers were quite contaminated. If you're old enough to understand what the Cuyahoga River is, that thing was on fire in Ohio. This incident really created the need for the EPA. Before this, the EPA wasn't around, and the Clean Water Act soon began discussion of the Clean Water Act about this, and this is really how EPA came to be what they are today. But as you can see, the Cuyahoga River was full of pollution. So wasn't the Bay in New York near Ellis Island. We also had local rivers. The Merrimack River was deemed one of the most polluted rivers in the country back before the Clean Water Act. You can see here are a couple main rivers where there's some paper mills discharging directly into the surface water before any treatment was ever put onto the system. But what did the Clean Water Act do? it began to clean up our surface water bodies and did a great job doing that. We're now able to recreate on these surface water bodies, and we even have now drinking water supplies that exist on these rivers themselves. And you can see here former President Reagan, back in 1984 in his State of the Union address, made a very valid point. Preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge, it is common sense. This is not a political situation, it's really about us and the people that we live with. So the rules and laws that we work with for residuals management and wastewater management in the state, we have our Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1972. RSA 485, which is the Water Pollution and Waste Disposal Act, which I'm sure you all are aware of, that was passed in 1990. For federal regulations, under the Clean Water Act, Section 405D, it specifically states that the department, EPA, is to develop rules and regulations on the management of sludge. Those are your 40 CFR Part 503 rules. You'll often hear them called the 503 regulations. For New Hampshire, we have two rule sets for the management of sludge and septage. EMVWQ 800 is our sludge management rules, and EMVWQ 1600 is our septage management rules. We do have two different management systems there because septage is not, when you're managing septage prior to a wastewater treatment facility, it definitely needs to have its own oversight and different regulations. But they are similar, and if you look at it from a higher level. So some of the efforts that we have done this year, we have, or in the last few years, our sludge quality certification investigation for PFAS has been going on since 2017. Again, I joined DES in 2018. Back in 2019 is when I revised everybody's sludge quality certificate to state that you are to monitor for PFAS annually. At that time, we were only looking at 9 compounds because that's all the labs could analyze for. Today, I can get a list of 24, up to 40, and even up to 70. Your method from the EPA, the multi-lab validated method that it will be for soils and sludge, will be a list of 40 compounds. We also created the Northeast Biosolid Improvement Program. That is a national group now. We have multiple state regulators, engineers, operators, managers from all sides of the industry coming together to create education outreach. What you're looking at here is part of one of our brochures we created for the public to talk about how PFAS is conveyed through the wastewater system and not a source, and a wastewater plant is not the source of PFAS. In fact, it's the victim of PFAS from industry and residents. This is another part of the brochure that we created to educate our operators and septage haulers in the state to understand why is the septage or why is there more sampling happening at the wastewater plant, and the difference between the sampling that they've done in the past and the sampling that they'll do in the future, because this now involves clean water sampling protocols where they have to pay attention to what they're wearing. If any of you are wearing makeup, lotion, or any other health and beauty care products today, you might be contributing PFAS to the wastewater system when you wash it off your face at night. And that's what they have to be careful of when they're sampling for, because they can cross-contaminate the sample with that material that might be on their body, on their hands, on their clothes, that then can transfer back into the sample. We've also, again, educated the public on what is PFAS and how does it impact wastewater systems and sludge management systems, and then what they can do to possibly reduce those concentrations. There's a website called pfascentral.org. It has an awesome banner at the top. It educates you on what you can buy that doesn't contain PFAS, meaning your cleaning chemicals, your clothes, and things like that. So you can make the effort personally at home to try to reduce those loadings. I'm going to show you some data here that'll show you how residents are discharging PFAS into the wastewater system. And it might be actually of a concern since residents are the mass loading onto a wastewater plant. We've also done some articles with NPR and other media outlets. If you remember last fall, if you saw last fall, I was the subject of Mara Hoppelmazian's article on what we're doing for PFAS regulation standard development, what Jeff just explained to you. This was a great article. I worked with Mara all year long on this. Took they out to our sample sites. Also took they out to our farm field where we did the phase 3 part of the study at one of our Biosolid sites. Just want to give you some quick numbers on sludge and septage management in the state. We recycle approximately over 40,000 wet tons of biosolids from the wastewater treatment facilities in New Hampshire. There's quite a few towns that are reliant on this permit program. If you're representing a town or community and you're interested to know if you are recycling, come ask me and I'll let you know. But there are quite a few. We landfill about 50,000 wet tons of biosolids or sludge annually. We call that sludge because it's not treated. So we're recycling about 35% of the sludge that's generated in the state. We're managing or creating about a little over 100,000 wet tons annually. On a 250-day schedule, that's almost 13 tractor-trailer trucks per day of sludge that needs to be managed, whether it's a landfill, incinerated, or land applied. We're also managing over 100 million gallons of septage annually that's being hauled around by our septic haulers and brought to a wastewater plant or a permitted facility. If you don't know, about 85% of the state is on septic systems, so this is a very important management program and a very important program to keep an eye on to make sure that all the septage is properly being disposed at the right place. As for our 6 operating line landfills in the state, we are generating over 100 million gallons of leachate annually. That is mostly being managed in the state at our local wastewater treatment facilities. If you're unaware, leachate that's generated at a landfill has to go to a wastewater treatment facility to be further processed and then discharged to the surface water body or groundwater if that wastewater plant has a rapid infiltration basin which it discharges into the ground. So quite a bit of leachate has to be managed in the state still. If you remember a few years ago, there was an article about the Lowell wastewater facility taking New Hampshire leachate. After that article, they quickly stopped taking that leachate, and now that leachate is going to New Jersey to be treated. So they're shipping their leachate about 8 hours down the road to be treated at a wastewater plant. What I'm going to show you here is the beginning of our investigation. I start with the collection system, meaning we go out and sample the sewer shed out in the streets. We pop manholes, we go into pump stations, and we do different sampling methods to see what we can find in the wastewater. And we're looking for general sources of PFAS entering the wastewater stream via industry or the public. When we do this, we aren't pinpointing specific businesses. We are actually looking at general areas. So if there's a parking lot that has a bunch of box stores, we're sampling that pump station, so it's not specifically one business. There may be, and here you may see a school here or there. There was a pump station that we did sample for a high school, and there were a couple other entities beyond that. What you're seeing here right now is a community. This is Sunapee, New Hampshire. They have the more higher concentration of PFAS in their sludge, which had me wondering why. It's mostly a residential community with not much industry. So we went around and sampled the residential communities of this system. And what this is TOPA, so it's total oxidizable precursor assay. And what they're doing is they're measuring the PFAS in the sample, and then they're oxidizing the sample and then remeasuring it again. By oxidizing the sample, what they're doing is breaking up all those precursors Jeff just talked about, the ones that we can't see in the normal test method, and exposing them, and then we're able to see what is really the concentration of, per se, PFOS and PFOA. So you'll see on this chart pre and post, and the letter before that means it's the same sample. So when we sample the normal test method that is used today, we don't see it. And we go, okay, it's not coming from residents. But then if we do top assay, all of a sudden it exposes the amount of precursors that a home is discharging. Meaning it could be coming off your makeup, your lotions, your soaps, your laundry detergent, your clothes. We just don't know because the SDSs that are out there for products that are sold to us don't indicate if PFAS is in it. Because it's at such a small concentration, they don't legally have to do that. And if they do, then they usually typically say it's proprietary or trade secret. So we don't even know what products we're buying off the shelf contain PFAS and what those concentrations are. But as you can see here, there is a contribution from residents, and it goes all the way up to 600 parts per trillion. This is not parts per billion, this is parts per trillion. I will show you sludge data in a sec that is parts per billion, just like soil and water. You will find soil, sludge in parts per billion, you'll find water in parts per trillion. So this was concerning to me. This actually started to say there's actually a different picture being painted, where it's not just industry discharging PFAS into our collection systems, it's also us. This right here is a different community. This is North Conway. We've gone out and done various other communities, and we're going to continue doing this with the money that we're getting from legislation to continue our investigation. This is North Conway, so you can see here this resident loading is very similar to Sunapee if you look at the scale below. The scale is obviously much higher because I actually went and sampled some industry and commercial areas of this community. This next sample was actually very alarming to me because this is the high school pump station. This means that the high school is discharging quite a bit of PFAS into the collection system that is absorbing onto the sludge, hence contaminating the sludge and the wastewater. We're finding through other investigations that this is coming out of the cleaning chemicals, the floor strippers and floor waxes that they're using at these schools, and also is coming off of the surfaces that the school has. through the studies that our Drinking Water Groundwater Bureau has done with these constituents. So this is alarming because we do have a lot of schools in the state that have drinking water wells and septic systems, and they are now on granulated activated carbon for those drinking water systems. Curiosity I have for wastewater is a septic system doing this or not? We don't know. We need more data. Do you want to wait till after? Okay, thank you. Yeah, please. What you're looking at here is leachate. This community actually has a circular system with their sludge and their leachate. They have a landfill and then they generate sludge from their wastewater plant. The sludge is landfilled and the leachate goes back to the wastewater plant. There's not many of these types of systems in New Hampshire because our sludge and our leachate and go in multiple different directions on different days. But this system is pretty unique. So what you're seeing here is that there's not much of a difference between the pre and the post. So the leachate is probably oxidizing through the landfill, exposing all those precursors to what they are. But there is a loading of leachate on here. We now have some research going on where this community is actually going to look at how could they potentially treat the leachate before it hits the headworks of the wastewater plant, hopefully reducing this loading at least from the leachate. This is what we see in the influent and effluent of the wastewater plant. So if you were to do the standard analysis today, you wouldn't see it in the influent. But if you do it on the effluent, you would see it. So that initially brought the conversation of a wastewater plant is generating PFAS. It is not. It is conveying it through the system because a wastewater plant is not designed to treat emerging contaminants. It's designed to treat the solids and the pathogens that are present in the wastewater, separating out the two, discharging clean water to the surface water body and creating sludge. So this top assay really exposes how there is a lot of unknown PFAS entering into the wastewater plant through systems like the school or residents or even businesses. As you can see on this chart, there are other larger ones. The commercial LR, that is your Home Depot and Walmart location, and then your LSGSMH, that other higher number, that is a hotel and retail center of North Conway. So it's residents and just retail, so no industry or any type of agriculture or anything like that. Next, I want to show you the sludge data that we've generated. So this is just last year's data. I have data, which I'll show you in a sec, that goes all the way back to 2017. As you can see on the bottom, this is in parts per billion. So the highest concentration we find in Class A biosolids right now is a little over 6 parts per billion. For PFOS, it's a little over 4 parts per billion, and for PFNA and PFHXS, it does not meet or meets 1 part per billion. As you see, there's different generators here. Some of this biosolids is strictly for farm fields, and some is allowed to be land applied on your golf course, on your ballpark, and potentially on your lawn if you choose to work with that company. Merrimack is on here, Hawk Ridge is on here. Those are both in-vessel compost systems, which I'm looking at because that energy that composting does, I think, breaks up a lot of these precursors into those known PFAS compounds we see. But again, the maximum concentration we saw in phase 1 was about 8 parts per billion for PFOS. So this is 6 parts per billion, just to take note. For the Class B biosolids, we have 3 generators, and in fact, the green line, that is our New Hampshire DES run wastewater facility, the Winnipesaukee River Basin Program. They service 10 communities in the state, and their biosolids was typically land applied at Class B permitted sites, but recently has now being trucked down to Merrimack to their compost facility because their contract changed, and the company that was managing it doesn't manage it anymore to those farm fields. So while I have this in the Class B numbers, I want to show you because the Winnipesaukee River Basin Program treatment is very much similar to the Nashua treatment. Nashua is the largest generator of biosolids in the state. They generate about 9,000 wet tons annually due to the population. And down below is Plymouth. They're a smaller community. They lime stabilize their biosolids, so they use quick lime to kill the pathogens, which is a higher pH material, which has to be paid attention in the field so you're not raising the pH too high. This is short paper fiber coming from our paper mills. So keep in mind that scale. The largest concentration we see does not exceed 1.8 parts per billion. Our paper mills today probably aren't using PFAS like they used to, or maybe just aren't using it all. As you heard maybe in the news, the main farms that were contaminated might have been contaminated from paper sludge. I think when you look at paper sludge, you have to look at what is the paper mill making and how much PFAS could possibly be a potential in that process. The Monadnock paper mill, this is the first time they ever had a hit, period, with me, this 1 year. Their procurement program, they're actually asking their vendors, are you testing for PFAS? What are your numbers? Can I see those? And they're making a decision on what they're taking in for recycled feedstock based on those conversations. They took that from my training I gave them. I wanted the plants to start, that are taking in outside waste, to start understanding what's coming into the plant and start having those conversations and potentially testing for it. What you're seeing here is drinking water residuals. We do allow drinking water sludge to be land applied. It has to be blended with soil to make a manufactured topsoil. We don't allow it to be directly land applied onto farm fields. But again, keep in mind that scale, highest concentration goes to 1.8 part, a little over 1.8 part per billion. So quickly, I want to talk about the future of sludge management. We are looking at destruction pathways and what is feasible and what could be done with our sludge in the future to better manage this material. Pyrolysis and gasification are two technologies that seem to be pretty applicable to sludge. Sludge is a pretty complex matrix. You just can't add on any technology to it and have successful destruction. But I am seeing that pyrolysis is creating a biochar that is completely free of PFAS. And in fact, biochar has a value to the market. In California, they're selling biochar for about $300 a yard. So a wastewater plant could potentially be generating a material that's safe for the environment and creating a revenue source for themselves if they have this technology. There are concerns about the air emissions of these technologies, so that's what we need to look at. If they were to burn and destroy this, would they be emitting PFAS into the environment, kind of like St. Cobain did? But you could put scrubbing on that. You could potentially have a scrubbing system that could treat that and potentially have that. You might see one of these units regionally. I've heard grumblings that the Portland Water District's interested in this and looking further into this. And I've talked to these companies quite a bit. They are interested in coming into New Hampshire, but they want to make sure they have a business that's viable, meaning they want to know that if they put one of these units in, they have 20, 30 years of business, meaning that our sludge is contaminated enough that it needs pyrolysis. This last technology I'm going to talk about is something Jeff and I are really interested in. We had them present to us last week in our PFAS coordinator meeting. It's called electrocoagulation. It almost seems too good to be true. We want to look further into this one. It doesn't have emissions like burning and incinerating, but it does actually destroy the sludge to a point where it takes away the PFAS or endocrine disruptors, pathogens, makes the metals into oxide forms so that they are not leachable, and actually destroys it takes the volume of the sludge down 80%, because most sludge is actually gas, if you didn't know that. And as well, it makes the sludge a better dewatered material so you can get it drier if you need to landfill it. As you saw with the numbers that are being recycled, 40,000 wet tons would not have a home today if we were to cut off land application. It would have to be stockpiled or put in a facility or sent out of state to be managed. Right now, Canada was taking a lot of New Hampshire sludge. They recently Quebec said no, or they created a moratorium that is reducing that sludge input. And we're hearing that New Brunswick is about to quickly follow suit. Because in Maine, they did ban land application, started sending it to the landfill, and within 6 months, the landfill said no more. They sent it to New Brunswick for about 2 weeks, and then New Brunswick said, we can't do this. Now they're talking about railing it down south from Unity, Maine, because the compost facility in Unity, Maine has now turned into an emergency stockpile location that has approval to do that until August. So we want to be careful on how we manage our sludge in the future. We need to add outlets to our management system. Right now it's a three-legged stool: land application, incineration, and landfilling. If you take one of those legs out, you don't have a stool anymore. There's a pun there if you want to think about it. And we need to add a leg. We need to add a fourth leg and a fifth leg, and maybe even a sixth leg. Because this material is always going to be generated as our population increases. We will only have more material to manage, and our farms are definitely decreasing. We are losing our farms and the management of this material on our farms. Farmers may not want this in the future. So we need to start thinking about where does this go and how do we manage it, and how do we successfully manage it as a state. Nope. And this is in the DOT parking lot. I think this is very appropriate for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for taking my questions. So I have a couple of questions. The first question was regarding surfaces at schools. You mentioned, quote, surfaces in Can you expand on what you mean by that?
So from the study, and I don't want to go too deep into that because it's a different person at DES that has done that study, Jennifer Hartman. But what she found is that she would do the analysis of the chemicals used prior to floor stripping and waxing, and then she would measure the wastewater of that waxing event, and also the water used as part of that. So she had essentially 3 components. When she looked at the signature of the PFAS in the cleaning chemical and then the signature in the wastewater, it was different. And it had legacy signatures to it, suggesting that it was pulling off wax off the floor. The stripping was doing its job, but it was pulling off old wax that potentially wasn't stripped off from years past, that had a different chemistry from those chemical companies. As we regulate these chemicals further, you can imagine chemical engineers are going to be changing the formulation of these compounds so they're not so detectable from test methods. But as we now have TAPA and other test methods, we can see those changes.
Thank you. And the second question I had was that I just briefly went on to your PFAScentral.org recommendation, which is great, I think. And it's interesting, there's a certain economic subset of products available that do not contain some of these. The other question I did have around that was I did notice that there were virtually no food products there that disclosed whether or not they were using hydrophobic liners in their packaging.
That's a very good point. I mean, we need to definitely look into that. I don't see many investigations happening about what is present in the food packaging and how is it transferring into the food. And then, as we know, there's over, or maybe you don't know, but there's over 450 species that have PFAS in their blood, and we're probably one of the most impacted ones. It's going to be in our blood for the rest of our lives. It might be in your kids' bloods and your grandchildren's blood if we don't start changing how we manage these materials. So we're releasing it, through our fecal matter and our urine every day. And are we eating more of it than we know? I don't know. That's what the science needs to show.
Thank you.
Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming in. This has been very fascinating and troubling. Did you figure out what was going on in Sunapee? Did you come to any conclusions about their numbers?
So when I look at Sunapee, to further investigate, we need to have them do more investigations on different parts of the collection system. I think residents are a problem. There's a recent article to come out about toilet paper, and actually toilet paper has a lot of PFAS in it. And so the article that I've read said that it could be a problem, that was in the conclusion. So with some of this funding that we're getting in the future here, I am going to be doing a toilet paper study, pulling toilet paper off the shelves of New Hampshire stores and doing different dilution factors. Obviously, if you have kids, you might be discharging more toilet paper than if you don't have kids. And I want to kind of see what that looks like. And maybe is that a mass loading that we should be concerned about? And maybe legislation could look into how is PFAS used in toilet paper? Is it needed? And what could be a good substitute for that? And then wipes. Don't want to bring up the topic, but wipes could obviously be an issue as well.
Yeah, Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so I have a lot of questions, and we won't be able to cover all of them. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the electrocoagulation, because it sounds like that might be a really promising technology, and I'm wondering how far away that is from getting up to scale.
So I am also very interested in the longevity and sustainability of that technology. It does use metal plates in its treatment. The metal plates do deteriorate 0.2 pounds every 1,000 gallons, so you can imagine they're changing out the plates in that electrolysis bath daily. What is the raw material availability? It's an iron and aluminum plate. There's quite a bit of iron and aluminum in our environment. However, if every single wastewater plant started putting this into their lines, what would that demand and supply look like? As for the technology itself, what we've been told from this one company, they have 150 units worldwide. They have units within the country. I am interested on the safety of the equipment. Luckily for New Hampshire and our 700 regulations, if you're to implement anything into a wastewater plant that is new, it has to go through a trial to determine if it is going to be safe for the operators. Is it going to perform the way it does? And then what is that outcome?
Thank you.
Representative Comtois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. From an agricultural standpoint, with the use of biosolids and other items, will that leachate into the plants if there are PFAS or PFOAs in that biosolid?
So there is literature review to say that plants do uptake PFAS. One thing about agriculture is that biosolids aren't the only thing being spread on a farm field that might contain PFAS. We haven't looked into manure yet. We haven't looked into herbicides yet. I'm even curious about Osmocote fertilizer, which is your coated nitrogen fertilizer. A lot of things that are used on a farm field that definitely have not been part of my investigation because I don't have oversight of that material. If we were to look into cropping and crop uptake, we definitely need Department of Ag's involvement and maybe even USDA's involvement. As Maine in their investigation at their biosolid sites, they did include Department of Ag and they did include other agencies and sections of the department to properly look at these sites. So we can't exclude everything else that is put on a farm field, but there's definitely questions about what is being uptaken between maybe corn silage, grain corn, hay, rye, soybean, and all those other crops. Typically our biosolids on an agricultural setting are only growing feed for animals. You don't see really any farmers using biosolids that are growing human consumption crops, and that's primarily because if their customers found out they were using biosolids, they probably wouldn't buy their vegetables. So a lot of times they use animal manure or leaf and lawn debris compost, but mostly commercial fertilizer.
Representative Comtois,
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's my understanding that in order to really delve into the agricultural side of this, we need to partner with the Department of Agriculture. Is that correct?
That is correct. If we look at a farm field that has received biosolids, it has not just received biosolids. So you automatically really have to look into Department of Ag. In my section, we regulate the soil, the sludge, and then we have, as a department, we regulate groundwater. Our rules and laws do not regulate crops. That is under the agricultural laws. So that would be under oversight.
yeah, one last follow-up.
Thank you. So, but would your department assist in looking at manure and how that is affecting and what the PFAS levels and PFOA levels are in that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm the guy that would probably have to train them on how to do that sampling. And I probably would be the guy that would do that sampling. I am pretty much known as a sludge sampler around the region and country now. I have no fear when it comes to material like that. So I enjoy training people. I did get an award last year from the EPA on training due to this compound. So I thoroughly enjoy training others on how to properly sample for this material.
Congratulations. Representative Coulon.
It seems like if I'm looking at your solutions part, that it looks like you're considering more like independent ways that New Hampshire can independently deal with waste inside our own state as opposed to selling it to other states or other countries.
An interesting thing to keep in mind about sludge is that it doesn't have real state borders in the management system of it. The interstate commerce law allows for the material to cross state lines and be managed in other states. I think as a state, though, we really need to look at how do we look at the management for our wastewater plants? We have almost a little over 70 wastewater plants in this state that are operating under NHDES permits that have oversight from the EPA. So if we are able to offer those technologies to those wastewater plants, they may have a safer and more sustainable future for the management of that sludge. As for an entity that would manage that destruction and that type of system, private sector seems to be having all the solutions right now. I don't know if we'd be able to support another facility next to our state-run wastewater plant or anything like that. But these private companies are coming in with new technologies and introducing it to us, so they seem to be working hard on that solution.
Representative Murray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks again. So I have an interesting question to sort of think about. A part of the solution, obviously, you were saying that as household, it seems that the evidence suggests that there's a large portion of PFAS coming out from households. To that end, I think a really important component of this is having the ability for consumers to know what they're purchasing. And I am really concerned that maybe that sort of full picture isn't there for folks.
Yeah, definitely. Source pollution prevention is the bigger way we're going to, or the easiest and I think the most efficient way where you're going to reduce these concentrations in our collection system. As like I said, sludge, wastewater, and wastewater plants are the victim. They're not the suspect. And so if we as people in industry can discharge less PFAS into that collection system, we are now going to have to manage less at a municipal system, at a public facility. And so if we look at controlling the commerce of PFAS, that is definitely a way to reduce that. The labeling of PFAS is definitely a way to get people to understand what they're buying. And as I said, on SDSs, or what are formerly called MSDSs, PFAS is used at such a small concentration it technically doesn't have to be on the SDS. So you don't have to disclose that as part of that chemistry.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so, another aspect I'm wondering about is, PFAS in compost, because, with, composting is now not just, leaf and, sort of yard waste, but it is also involves some combination of, animal waste and also food waste, and also, the sort of, compostable, eating containers and paper dishware, which used to just be landfilled but now could be composted, and also like pizza boxes and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And I'm wondering how that. Have you done any investigation of compost, and how has that panned out?
So last fall, I was able to go out and buy a few food waste compost bags at the General Garden Store in New Hampshire. It was down in the southern part of the state. We looked at, there are out-of-state generators because technically there isn't really a food waste composter selling bagged products yet in New Hampshire. These rules are pretty fresh. But we did look at that, and we did do sampling, and we saw less concentrations than what you see in Class A biosolids. So it's suggesting that food waste compost might not be as impacted as biosolids are. And that's probably pretty true, I would say. I mean, we definitely need to further that investigation and look into other products. We looked at 4. There's multiple different ones. As from the Fertilizer Study Commission, we understand there's about 800 registered fertilizers in the state. And so how many of those are being sampled and looked at? I think 2. What came about that. So when you look at these investigations, I sample the whole SQC program. I do equipment blanks and field blanks to quality check to make sure I am not cross-contaminating the sample. So I'm looking at everything. And I think you got to do that because PFAS is so ubiquitous in our environment, you really have to look, it's case by case. And that could even go with soils.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick comment. As a member of the advisory committee of the Seacoast Public Health Network, I get all kinds of information about PFAS. A lot of us do. My town got a grant to test private wells, and I think that system is going to be very helpful. I did notice a press release that 10 private wells in the towns of Dalton, Whitefield, and Bethlehem were also tested and came out with 0.0 of whatever combination they were testing. So we have these pristine perennial bodies of water in our state, and we need to protect them because that's why people want to be here and move their businesses here. So thanks for the work you're doing.
Thank you. That's our job as DES, is to create standards and regulations that support the laws. And that's what we're doing today.
Representative Coulon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So with the agricultural land applications that have received, the sludge dumping for decades and decades, are you testing the land themselves? Because I know there's a lot of sites that have been receiving this stuff for a long time.
So we have phase 3 was looking at an AFFF site and a biosolid site. We sampled the White Farm facility, or White Farm on Clinton Street here. That is a state-owned property, so that was pretty easy to get permission to go out and do that. The investigation has not happened at farm fields for a couple reasons. A, I don't have the staff, manpower to go out and start sampling every single farm field that's received biosolids. We'd have to probably develop an RFQ and have a company go out and do that. Also, as well, we would have to get the we could go out and do the Class B sites, but the Class A sites, we'd have to get permission from the property owner because those aren't site permitted. So that would involve a lot of work on that end that we just don't have the manpower for. So we were able to focus on the sludge component of our program because that is the first part, how it's distributed, and that's where we were doing our sampling. So if we do move forward, we would need some money to hire a company to go out and do that. That is quite a task to take on.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so another question I have is about how leachate from landfills is handled, and is there some sort of pre-treatment so that that doesn't get into, so that PFAS that might be in that doesn't get into the wastewater treatment plant, or is the wastewater treatment plant essentially getting loaded with whatever PFAS might be in the leachate?
So again, a wastewater plant is not designed to treat for emerging contaminants, so it is being loaded with PFAS. Whatever's in that leachate, it's being loaded with. And that's, you know, accumulating in the sludge or being present in the wastewater effluent as it discharges. So when we do look at treatment systems, there is funding available now to wastewater facilities that do accept leachate to look into treatment systems that could treat that leachate. Like I said, North Conway is one of the applicants for that funding. We're very excited that they're willing to look into this. Jason Gagnon, the superintendent there, he's very proactive on this subject matter. And there are a couple technologies out there that could potentially do it. We just haven't completely looked into it. Electrocoagulation would be one. Maybe supercritical water oxidation could be another. I'm not so sure pyrolysis and gasification are the technologies for that media, because that's a liquid media, and pyrolysis and gasification is a solid destructions. I think if you did granule activated carbon on leachate, you'd find that you'd be going through media pretty quick, and it would clog that media really fast. So the standard granulated activated carbon that can clean your private well or your drinking water plant, that's a cleaner matrix. It can handle that. As we know, leachate is the juice from the landfill, so it's not so clean.
Any other questions? No. Oh, Representative.
I'm not looking for a detailed answer now, but if you have ideas for legislation that might help you do your job better or more extensively, I think our committee would be happy to help you out with working on that.
Looking further into destruction is definitely something we need to do. Researching it more, seeing what pathway is going to be a viable outlet for New Hampshire, or at least a safe outlet for our human health and the environment. As our job, we are here to protect human health and the environment. So we want to make sure whatever technology is coming into the state, it is going to do its job and do its job safely. So that would involve trials, potentially allowing these companies to come in and exhibit their technology to show, are they properly doing what they're saying they're doing?
Guess you need a Shark Tank, huh? You know,
Be kind of nice, right?
have them come into New Hampshire, and you be the Shark Tank guys,
Yeah.
right?
We can make it a science episode.
Right, okay. Well, we really, really appreciate your presentation this afternoon, this morning, actually. And more so that you were patient to wait until we were done with the business that we had to attend to as our committee. But thank you very, very much for taking the time and giving us this very important information.
Great, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for the committee for giving us the opportunity to speak today. Appreciate it.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the committee for the opportunity to educate you on the residuals program. Not many people know what happens after you flush the toilet, so it's good to learn that. Thank you.
And you will be sending along your slides so that we can peruse them a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just in time for lunch, yeah. Thank you very much, appreciate it. Sure, Representative Comtois.
Yeah, this is, I don't need to speak. I'm on the Governor's Council for the Humane Treatment of Animals, and I have a survey. I'm on the Governor's Council for the Humane Treatment of Animals, and there's a survey that we're conducting. And I was wondering if anyone would mind if I sent it to you to get your opinions. And please feel free to forward it on to anybody. Replies are due by May 31st.
Okay,
Thank you.
send it along. Yeah, Representative Nam.
I don't know if you saw, but we got an email from a winery about losing their grapes.
Yeah.
How do we respond, or how do you respond? What's the process of our committee?
I was going to forward that along to